Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about marine mammals. That's whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, sea lions, walruses, even manatees and dugongs. They're all marine mammals. And the health of our marine mammals is the planet's canary in a coal mine. For as the ocean goes, so goes the land and all of us that dwell upon it. We know that climate change is causing the world's oceans to become warmer, to become more acidic, and that a constant stream of petrochemicals and microplastics are turning the oceans into a toxic wasteland. The impact on marine mammals is an early warning system that predicts the future of land mammals. So the study and preservation of our deep water friends is important to us and our future. We're joined on Zoom today by Ted Cheeseman, co-founder and director of Happy Whale. Hi, Ted.
Hi there.
Philip Hamilton is the interim chair of the Kraus Marine Mammal Program and senior scientist for the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium. Hi, Philip.
Hey, Bob. How you doing?
And Adam Ratner, director of conservation engagement at the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito, California. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for having me today.
I'd like to start by going around the room and identifying the marine mammal populations each of you work with. Ted, you've been guiding expeditions to Antarctica for what, 30 years? What kind of marine mammals do you see there?
I have been, worked in Antarctica a lot. It's a diverse world, but the animals that we see the most are humpback whales, and that's a huge change from when I started going down there 30 years ago. Saw almost none.
So you're seeing the whales migrate south? I mean, is that why you're seeing more of them in that region?
Well, no, they've been recovering from whaling. Actually, it's a very, our oceans are filling up with microplastics, but there's these incredibly positive stories going on too, which is that last century we removed all the whales, and now that where some species and some populations are recovering very well. It's not a universal story, but yeah, that's been the sort of the brightest spot for me, is places where the largest whaling stations in the world, and no whales for hundreds of miles. For 20 years did not see a single nearshore whale around South Georgia, and now it's a common thing to see. So yeah, humpback whales mostly, but also blues, fins, sperm whale, minke whale, and I work on humpback whales. That's what I'm doing my PhD on.
Yeah. Well, that's surprisingly good news. We hope we hear more of that. Philip, you're based in Boston on the North Atlantic coast. What kind of marine mammals do you work with?
Yeah, so I've been studying primarily North Atlantic right whales, and they go from Florida up to Nova Scotia, Canada, and some areas further afield. Been doing it for almost 40 years now. We know pretty much the entire population. It's that small, only around 350 animals left. And like Ted was talking about, there are some populations that are doing really well, and some in the Atlantic as well. And North Atlantic right whales are not one of them. And climate is one of the impacts that we'll get into later. But really powerful to work with a species where you know every individual in the species.
Adam, you're based in Sausalito on the Pacific coast. What kind of marine mammals do you work with?
So I work at the world's largest marine mammal hospital. So we're rescuing any sick or injured seal, sea lion, otter, dolphin, even whale found over 600 miles of California coast. We also have a hospital out in Hawaii for the endangered Hawaiian monk seal. So we get a wide range. It just shows how lucky we are in California, essentially, to have these animals in our backyard. But it means that there's a little bit of extra pressure to try and help take care of that ocean. How do we share our shores? How do we share that ocean with all of these animals so both people and marine mammals can thrive?
Philip, sounds like you're fairly familiar with your whales. How well do you know the individual whales you study?
Really well, actually. At my peak, now I've become a little bit too much of a desk jockey, but at my peak, when I was fortunate enough to be out on the water a lot more, I knew probably 200 whales on site, and not just the whales themselves, but be like, oh yeah, that's so-and-so's offspring, and know a story that I remember from being out in the water with them or seeing them from a plane. So it's it's one of the things that is so compelling about working with this species is that there's a great deal of intimacy. We know a tremendous amount about them because there's this concerted effort of research all along the eastern seaboard. Many different organizations are working on this species, and all the photographs get contributed to us at the New England Aquarium because we manage the photo identification catalog. But I also, one of the things I love about being a scientist and working with marine mammals in particular, everything you know will be turned on its head at one point or another. There's so many mysteries and big mysteries still. So it's a very compelling combination to know so much detail and still have we don't even know how right whales find their food. They're extraordinarily good at finding these very dense, relatively small patches of plankton that they feed on. How do they do it? I love that mystery.
So you obviously know your whales very well on a personal level. What kind of climate impacts are you seeing?
It's a lot. So, initially the first sort of evidence was around 2010, where they stopped feeding, not completely stopped, but decreased their feeding in 3 of their 5 feeding habitats, where we used to see 200 whales. Now, it got down to maybe 50, and now in some areas we don't really see any right whales anymore. So a huge change in where they feed, also when they feed. Some of the habitats that they continue to go to, like Cape Cod Bay, they're going much earlier than they used to. But in that abandonment or near abandonment of some of their feeding habitats, they have found other habitats, and some of which were very dangerous for them. There were some protective measurements in the known habitats, but for example, about a third of the population moved up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And in 2017, we had 13 deaths there out of, around 350 whales. They were getting hit by vessels and entangled in fishing gear up there. And it started a whole unusual mortality event where we've lost about 20% of the population in response to those dangers. As well as the added dangers in these new areas, they're not getting as much food as they used to, it appears. So their reproduction has also decreased to the point that in 2018, we had no calves born into the population. So it's a pairing of events all related to shifting ocean resources that's been really catastrophic. High mortality, high sublethal impact. So another piece is that both because of poor feeding and sublethal impacts from past entanglements, that impacts their reproduction and it impacts their growth. And we know that now right whales nowadays are growing, not growing as large as they did in the 80s. And we know that the smaller whales are also not giving birth to as many calves. And that's a combination of things. So it's a cascading event, the impacts of climate on these species.
Adam, what kind of impacts is climate having on your population?
So you heard a little bit from Philip and even Ted, these animals are incredibly resilient. What we see is a lot of the environment that they depend on changing. So the same way that the North Atlantic right whales are having to shift areas to find the food, we're seeing the same impacts on the West Coast in California. So that warming water is changing where the fish like to hang out. So the fish are going deeper or farther offshore in many cases. So California sea lions are having to dive deeper or go farther to find food. And that's impacting particularly the mom-pup relationship, and that these babies aren't getting enough nutrients, enough time with their mom if their mom has to go farther offshore. We're also seeing the kind of cascading effects of the environment in the sense of sea level rise, that as those waters warm, they also expand. And that's taking up a lot of these breeding beaches that elephant seals, Hawaiian monk seals depend on. So they're more prone to being separated from big storms, or just simply those kind of habitats are shrinking. They have less space up on land to mate, to nurse, to rest. So we're seeing a lot of effects across a wide range of marine mammals, and it's in the same environments that people are spending a lot of time. The beaches, the communities that we all depend on are losing that same space. The food we depend on is moving. So we see this great intersection between what's happening with marine mammals and people, and that gives us ideas of how we can help protect both the animals and people and what actions we take next.
And Ted, you mentioned you're seeing a growth in humpback whale population, probably more to do with the decrease in whaling than climate. But whether Antarctica or other regions, what kind of climate impacts are you seeing?
It's a great question, a really interesting dynamic because, like, as a scientist, like, what you want is to reduce the variables, right? And find one variable that you can study to see how that affects it. But here we have, at the same time, okay, so most major commercial whaling ended in the 70s, 50 years ago-ish, right? And there's a lot of different stories, different species, different regions. But if you say 1970s, basically most of the world has been without major commercial whaling for 50 years. That gave these whales the chance to recover to their natural populations. But what we're looking at is that they're recovering into oceans that are very different from the oceans that they were hunted out of. And so when you take off the direct, basically the direct selective pressure of whaling, well, that pressure is gone. But we don't know at this point what the oceans are like compared to the oceans that were natural, largely unwhaled back in, say, the 1700s, or in some cases, the North Atlantic right whales. I guess you'd have to go back to probably 1500s to have no whaling at all. And the oceans have changed a lot since then. So I've just finished a study and was published not so long ago about basically what ended up a focus of the climate impact on the North Pacific. And this was a total surprise because what we were looking for was just to make a model of the population of the North Pacific humpback whales, right? Because historically, there was an estimate in the 70s, there was another estimate in the 90s, and then mid 2000s. And it was these dots 10, 15, 20 years apart. And so we looked at it year by year, and to our huge surprise, there was a 20% drop, pretty much centered on 2014 to 2016, when there was the largest marine heat wave that's ever been recorded. So we went basically from, the IUCN Red List, for example, doesn't mention climate change as a risk to humpback whales. A 2011 review of world's populations of humpback whales said there's no known impact from climate change, to suddenly, arguably, the single biggest impact to the species since whaling ended is pretty strong, directly a result of climate change. So what I see is, yes, a lot of the populations of the species are doing really well, but we have this major new emerging element that climate change can cause heat waves. When you say a heat wave, I think of a hot weekend or a hot week, or, oh, Phoenix is blistering for, July. But this was a 3-year heat wave, and it's outside. Models are predicting, and evidence is already showing, longer duration, greater severity, larger area. And all these things combined push these environments outside of a space that our favorite species, our beloved whales and marine mammals, things that they're not adapted for.
That period you're talking about, that heat wave, that was worldwide. You're talking about the North Pacific marine heat wave. I remember some work I was doing in the Midwest US, and the trees that were dying because of that extended heat wave, mature trees that, the efforts that cities and stuff are going to water their trees and such. So it's interesting that kind of drought heat wave impact on land can also be affecting the oceans and the populations in the oceans. Adam, you talked a little bit about warming waters and changes in migration and such. How does ocean acidification affect marine mammals?
So with ocean acidification, the ocean's gotten around 30% more acidic since the Industrial Revolution. So a pretty drastic change that we've seen. And similar to some of the kind of warming water affecting the fish populations, it's these indirect effects that we're seeing. So particularly things like the shell building animals, the lower level on the food chain with zooplankton and crustaceans, those are animals that are going to struggle to build those calcium carbonate shells that they need. For whales, a lot of those animals depend on the zooplankton. For seals and sea lions, they eat fish that depend on that zooplankton. So we're seeing a part of the food chain really struggling, and that's going to wind up having effects going farther up. The other big one is that some phytoplankton really like the acidic water. So we're seeing these harmful algal blooms. When you have natural algae, but you get too much of them, they can actually release a toxin. And on the west coast of the United States, the big one that we see is something called domoic acid. And we've seen major blooms of this algae releasing toxins that are affecting hundreds of seals and sea lions. We've seen it affecting dolphins and whales even. We saw a big overlap between domoic acid and the Gulf of Alaska during that big heat wave that Ted talked about. So we know that this is something that's emerging. The more we see these kind of heat waves, the warming waters, the more acidic water, it's providing kind of a perfect breeding ground almost for some of these new threats to emerge that can cause things like hippocampus damage, so affecting the brain, memory loss, seizures in marine mammals. Luckily, if it's caught in time, it can be treated. But we do see at the Marine Mammal Center alone over 100 animals a year typically coming into some of these harmful algal blooms like domoic acid toxicosis.
You're mentioning algae blooms. Is that what I hear referred to as red tides?
Yeah, so there are lots of different names for what it goes by. Typically in the news, you'll hear harmful algal blooms called red tide as kind of an overarching concept. Really, some of the algae turn the water red, so it's a really good thing from a descriptor. Other harmful algal blooms will turn the water green, like other typical algae. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, but if you've heard red tide in the news, this is the same concept, except sometimes the algae will actually be a different color, but it builds up that food chain and can cause effects for the animals at the top of the food chain.
Adam, I've heard you refer to marine mammals as the sentinels of the sea. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and you mentioned this earlier, Bob, this idea of canary in the coal mine. And we breathe the same air that marine mammals do. We eat the same food that marine mammals do. We swim in the same water that marine mammals do. So they provide this great glimpse into ocean health. These issues that you've heard about, things like harmful algal blooms and toxins, they affect people as well. So with California sea lions, for example, the Marine Mammal Center was the first to identify domoic acid in marine mammals back in the 1990s. But 10 years prior to that, people were actually dying from a mysterious illness up in Canada. It was deemed amnesic shellfish poisoning. We were able to kind of help put the dots together and realize that the sea lions could be an early warning system to these algal blooms that affect people. So we work closely with the Department of Public Health that if we started seeing animals coming in with this toxin, we could get on the phone, call the Department of Public Health, and they'd shut down those fisheries or test certain areas. Since we've been able to build a bigger network, that there really is this early warning system, and not a single person is getting sick and dying from domoic acid today compared to people dying back in the 1980s before this connection was really made. So we've got this ability to help protect people by protecting marine mammals. We also have a chance to see a little bit about what are the impacts of warming water temperatures and more acidic waters on marine mammals and what that leads to for larger ocean health. So this heat wave that happened back in 2014 through 2016, that was an extraordinary event. But with climate change, we predicted something that's going to happen way more regularly moving forward if we don't take action. So we now have this idea of what the future could hold if we don't take action, and gives us good reason to do things today. And none of it's faded. If we act, if we reduce our use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, methane, gas, we can prevent some of these more drastic effects for the marine mammals you're hearing about in the future.
Philip, I think you may have touched on this earlier, but can you tell us more about your experience at the Bay of Fundy?
Yeah, so the Bay of Fundy is one of the three feeding habitats that I mentioned that right whales largely abandoned, not completely. And I've been going there since 1988. And it's a really extraordinary habitat. The tides there make it very dynamic, amazing bird life. And there's a smell. And I remember going out day after day and that smell. And we'd always see right whales and sometimes, 30, 40, 50 individuals. And it's interesting to me that I'm a scientist. I know about climate change. I've read about it. I know it's changing gardening seasons, all these other things. But my experience of having gone out and feel like this intimate connection to a place and experience whales changing and leaving that habitat somehow made climate change way more tangible to me. It's much more experiential, and I don't know. I'm intrigued by that. I think there are a lot of people who don't know or care about climate change, and I kind of understand that, having known the difference of my experience of having all the information and knowing it's an issue, but then actually experiencing the loss. It makes it matter more to me personally, and that's I would love to see mechanisms to have people have a human experience of what climate change means, not just information, because we have a lot of that and it's overwhelming. People often don't actually respond to information well, but they do respond to personal experiences. So I feel oddly, although it's incredibly sad for me, I feel sort of fortunate to have had that intimate experience of what climate change actually means and what it meant to me it's I mean, really the Bay of Fundy is magical, I think. And we no longer, after 3 or 4 years of going and seeing very, very few whales, we abandoned that habitat just as the whales did. And it's a real loss.
So Ted, I mean, Philip's reporting big changes in the right whale population. What kind of changes are you seeing in other populations around the world? I mean, you have experience in Antarctic and North Pacific. Is this a global thing, or is it just certain groups that are being affected?
The marine heat wave that we saw as the signature for this, or the cause of this specific decline that we found in this model, and evidence was very sorry evidence was very clear locally, like Glacier Bay. That was restricted to the Northeast Pacific. Sorry. But could it happen? I think the physical elements very much, you could have a similar heat wave in the North Atlantic. The Antarctic is a very different place because you have this circumpolar current. So it pushes, you don't have a body of water that sits there as statically or stably as in these northern oceans that are bounded by by continents, sorry. And so I think you have a very different dynamic there, but you have an ice edge that is, for years and years we thought, oh well, the Antarctic is buffered from climate change because of this current. So isn't that great? Maybe it'll be a holdout until some level of extreme climate change. Well, it seems like we're getting to that extreme level of climate change where the sea ice extent is far, the last couple of years have been shockingly low sea ice extent, and that dynamic is really important for the whales and the ecosystems. I mean, this isn't just like, are these whales heating to death? That's not what's happening. It's that because warmer waters produce less food, the whales aren't finding their food. And the struggle with this is, I think there's two parts of the struggle. One is that these are big remote ecosystems that we don't, there are lots of open questions. I think there's another very human struggle with this, and it's just what Phil was talking about, is it's hard to relate to numbers of populations that are far away. I mean, it's 7,000 whales in the North Pacific. What does that even mean or look like? Whereas there's some of the individual whales that washed up in Southeast Alaska had 30 or 40-year sighting histories, and were known. There's a whale that's called Festus, I think named after the Caesar Festus, that was known very, very well from repeatedly showing up in Glacier Bay. And those who did the necropsy, the autopsy work, it was a personal experience, much like Phil is talking about there. I think that's pretty meaningful.
Adam, what kind of changes are you expecting in the coming decades?
So very similar to what you've heard from Philip and Ted, a lot of this is related to the warming water temperatures and how it's going to affect that larger ecosystem. Marine mammals are really resilient creatures to a point. So we're seeing the food shifting locations, and therefore the animals are moving to new locations. That's resilient behavior on their part, but they might wind up intersecting with other threats then, whether it's established shipping lanes, whether it's fishing gear, areas that they've kind of carved out where this is the place for whales, this is the place for people. Those lines start to blur as the oceans are changing, and we're seeing a lot more interaction now between the people and the animals. That's going to be one big dynamic, and unfortunately, we're starting to see some of those impacts already with fishing gear and shipping strikes for the big whales, but also for some of the seals and sea lions. I think the other piece is that land environment, these animals that depend on a place to come up onto the beaches to rest, to have their pups. Are those places still safe for them from extreme weather events? Are they still built in a place that the pups can rest and nurse without being swept away from big storms? Those are some of the really big questions that we have to try and answer. And exactly to what you heard with Philip and Ted, we've got a lot of answers right now of the impacts. There are a lot of questions still out there. And what gives me hope is that there's a lot of people out there that care about this. There are a lot of people that love marine mammals. And if we can help mobilize people around this action that we can take in our own backyards, our own homes, our own businesses, it can actually help create that healthy ocean, even if they're not near the ocean themselves.
Bob, I'd love to jump in if I can.
Sure.
Yeah. As far as what's coming in the future, many of you may have heard that our aerial survey team recently saw a gray whale off of Massachusetts. And that gray whale, for those who don't know, gray whales are extinct in the North Atlantic. And so that gray whale almost definitely came through the Northwest Passage from the Pacific. And it opens up a whole bunch of questions about what else is going to start moving between the Atlantic and the Pacific through that passageway, including, invertebrates. I mean, that is a massive experiment that is underway, and who knows how that plays out. But it was very noteworthy to see a gray whale, and there have been a few sightings over the last decade or so, but it's a whole new world.
You're listening
I would
to
also
the Climate
say,
Hour.
I would also just say it speaks to the value of the science and the need for some of this, that there are the eyes, the ears, the programs like Happy Whale, the researchers from New England Aquarium and other groups that are out there to be able to get these clues and answers that are otherwise really hard to find when we're talking about individuals or elusive species.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Adam Ratner, Philip Hamilton, and Ted Cheeseman about marine mammals. So we're having a good conversation on migrations and impacts, climate and otherwise. It seems like a lot of that is food driven. I mean, obviously the food chain breaks up, the whales move someplace else. I'd like to shift the conversation to marine debris. I mean, that's human created solid materials that are accidentally or deliberately dumped into the ocean. And we know there's a lot of climate impacts from dumping. There's obviously the greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing, but there's also methane emissions from landfills, and there's similar climate impacts from the trash floating around in our oceans. Marine mammals experience the same toxic dumping that we experience on land, except they're swimming in it. I would think some of these migrations and some of the population effects we're seeing have to be driven by the marine debris, not only the physical entanglements, which I'm sure we've got a lot of stories on, but also the chemicals, the toxic, persistent chemicals that are building up in the ocean. Ted, what are your thoughts? How do marine debris dumping affect marine mammals?
Certainly the first place I go is entanglement, right? The way I look at the large whales that I mostly focus on, and humpback whales in specific, there's really three major threats. And it seems like by the numbers, climate change may be the biggest of them, but the most visceral, the ones that we see in impact and scarring on whales and death of whales, entanglement and ship strikes, right? So we're urbanizing, industrializing the oceans, and that has its signature, right? We're just putting a lot of stuff in there. Most of the entanglement issues with large whales is from actually active gear, not so much trash, but that is a real thing too. What is in there that's not known is this, like, well, these animals are ingesting a lot from microplastics on up. Sperm whales with their bellies full of plastic. Apparently, this is not my area of expertise, but apparently a plastic bag and the way algae grows on it, it actually looks acoustically much like a food object, a squid or something like this. So you have a sperm whale and maybe a novice sperm whale, maybe adults are less susceptible to this, but a young animal is important to the population, may be fooled into, and ending up with a stomach full of plastic bags, literally starving to death with a mouth full. We don't know. We just don't know. These animals ingesting microplastics by in uncountable amounts. And I hear stories like, oh, it's, as if a bowl full or a bucket full a day in terms of total volume, which to a large whale might not be a lot. But if this accumulates in their tissues, there might be endocrine effects, there might be hormonal effects. There's a big unknown, and we can't equate an unknown to a lack of an impact.
Yeah, I just published a new book called Unpacking the Plastics Pandemic, and my research found a lot of what you're talking about. I was looking more at the impacts on humans and land-based animals, but the whales, the marine mammals must be experiencing the same thing. One of the reports that caught my eye while I was doing research was that over half of beached whales have PCB levels in their bodies 30 times the toxicity level, and that's beached whales. You have to wonder if the beaching is somehow related to these chemical toxicities. PCBs was banned 20 years ago, but we're still seeing these buildups in marine animals. Adam, I turn to you on this. You have the largest marine mammal hospital. Is your group doing work with this kind of toxicity or studying it?
Yeah, we see both sides of the spectrum, exactly what Ted mentioned. So we see animals being found out on California beaches entangled in trash and having swallowed trash by accident, mistaking it for food, and this kind of heartbreaking sight of animals that are coming in due to direct human issues. Luckily, we can save a lot of them, but we've seen the plastic bags, we've seen the microplastics, the balloons in and around these animals. The more insidious one, the harder to track, is these chemicals and what are either the microplastics impact or things like PCBs, or in our case, DDT is actually a big one that we still see. Even though DDT was banned for export by the US over 35, 40 years ago at this point, these chemicals last a really long time, and we still see the impact of them. And one of the most jarring situations is actually cancer in California sea lions. So the Marine Mammal Center rescues sick and injured California sea lions, and around 20% of the adult sea lions that die in our care, ones that we're not able to save, actually have a reproductive urinary carcinoma. And we've realized that there are two main factors that are leading to this cancer. There's PCBs and DDT, so contaminants, and then there's a viral component. But we know that even though these things haven't been used prominently in the United States in decades, the impact it's having on sea lions is still prominent today for animals' health. So that just speaks to why taking action now is so important on some of these things, because the impacts can last decades for all these animals.
You're
You know,
talking about, go ahead, Ted.
Sorry. Well, we don't have a lot of detail about PCBs and et cetera in right whales, but it's interesting. We have some females, and one in particular that has developed this this dysfunction where she's able to get pregnant. She's very successful at doing that, but she hasn't been able to nurse her calves for the last 6 calves. And we watch her slowly in the calves each time. It's heartbreaking as they get thinner and thinner. And I'm so curious to know what caused, because she could nurse her initial calves, and it just made me think about that, given what you're saying, Adam.
Yeah, and I've seen similar research up in the orca, or the killer whale population in Washington State, where you have these animals that have incredibly high amounts of these harmful chemicals and contaminants, and what impact that might have, to Ted's point around the endocrine system and the hormones and how these things can impact all these different elements. So we don't have the direct linkage for some of these things on some of these issues, but we know that it just can't be good. So we need to take action to try and reduce that burden of risk for some of these animals, particularly those that are incredibly endangered, whether it's that orca population in near Puget Sound, whether it's the right whales on the East Coast. Some of these populations, literally every individual matters to keep that animal from extinction.
I've seen several reports on the chemical levels in the orca populations, that's affecting them. Also, we're talking about plastic bags and such down at the smaller level of the plastic nurdles, the plastic pellets that they ship around the world. I know that there was a ship Express Pearl that sank in the Indian Ocean and dumped 87 containers, shipping containers full of pellets, and that killed dozens of whales, thousands of sea turtles. That's having impact on the orca populations there. And that also brings me to the giant garbage patches we have around the world. The ocean gyres, the currents that kind of concentrate these plastics into these islands. Islands is kind of a misnomer. You can't walk on them, but obviously piles and piles of plastics. The giant Pacific garbage patch between Sausalito and Hawaii, that's the size of the state of Texas, twice the size of the state of Texas. It's huge. These have to be impacting whales' behaviors. Ted, do you have any sense of whale migrations or stuff? I mean, how does these garbage patches impact the whale's ability to feed and migrate?
These are tough questions to really peg, but absolutely migratory pass through these. And there's we tend to be very focused on near coastal and the animals that we can see, but there's species. I think one of the things I really love about working with whales and the great oceans is that there's species, there's still new species being described. Sometimes that's like the Rice's whale in the Gulf of Mexico that we realized, okay, they've been seen, but we didn't realize that they were actually quite different from a Brutus whale, right? So here's a new species just on a doorstep of one of the most industrialized patches of ocean in the world. Talk about a place that got heavy impact, and only about 50 of these animals. But there's also these amazing animals called beaked whales, which some species have been found to be able to dive for 3 hours at a time. And one particularly poorly known set of these is actually the mid-Pacific garbage patch is believed to be their prime habitat. Like, it's like, where would you go? Well, actually fish are somewhat attracted to these patches of garbage. So it may actually be a feeding target area where, the animals can't possibly know that they're, maybe at risk of ingesting extremely toxic materials and in the course of it. But we know humpback whales certainly migrate through some of these patches. They probably are not feeding along the way. They're probably just traveling. What impact does that have? Well, hard to know. But I think kind of stepping back one step there, what Adam was speaking to, and orcas, much like us, they are the top of the food chain. And I think it's, a big part of what motivates our study of these whales is their mystery, but also to a certain extent, they're parallels to where we are on this planet. We have a lot of similarities to orcas and these large whales that are feeding at the top of their food chain. And if there's bioaccumulation of toxicity, making their flesh literally effectively toxic waste, are we eating those same foods? We're fishing the same oceans. We're pulling salmon out of there, and we think it's the best food in the world. And where does that land us? Yeah.
It's very true, very true. I mean, we look at tuna, salmon, those are also top food chains, and that bioaccumulation of those toxins, the PCBs and such, they accumulate, and when you eat them, they just accumulate in the higher animal, and they're building up, and then we eat them. So in a ways, I agree, Ted, we're just like the orcas. It has to be affecting us. What about offshore infrastructure? I mean, this is shifting topics. This isn't a waste per se, but offshore infrastructure. Let's talk about offshore wind farms. How are they affecting your populations? Philip, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I can answer quickly. We don't know, but there's a lot more behind that answer. Yeah, so there's actually wind farms just being developed in the North Atlantic, and one of those is in an area that has been an increasing right whale habitat recently, south of Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. And so there's a lot of interest and concern. We don't know, from my perspective, we have an opportunity to be working to try to get the studies done to actually figure out what is the impact, be working with industry to try to, ameliorate any of the issues like the noise when they're actually putting in the pilings to support offshore wind are a concern, but there actually are mitigation measures. A really clever one is you can have a stream of bubbles around the sound so that the sound actually doesn't come out of that bubble column. There's been some concern about that the blades themselves, as they turn, change the wind patterns right at the surface of the water that could reduce plankton or could potentially improve plankton. We don't really know. From my perspective, with right whales specifically, we know that we have a really big problem with entanglements and vessel strikes. And so, and there has been a tendency in some places to sort of distract from that and say, well, wind farms are really the big issue. Don't worry about the entanglements and the vessel strikes. And from my perspective, we know we have to deal with those two issues, which we already have 30, 40 years of data on how detrimental it is to the population. And as far as wind farms, we work with them to try to make sure that we minimize any of the impacts and, learn what they truly are, and then make wise decisions based on that. It's a very complicated issue, though. I think many of us who love the oceans and love the animals in the oceans would love to have a totally industry-free ocean. But you really do have to balance that against what are the impacts of climate change. And as Ted and Adam have been saying, they are significant, and we can't just ignore that.
Adam, what's your thoughts on offshore wind farms and other infrastructure?
So as you heard, it's a little bit nascent in the United States. So we don't have as much data yet, although it's really emerging, first on the East Coast and soon on the West Coast. We can look to other places in Europe that have built offshore wind farms, and we've seen that there can be some effects. But as Philip mentioned, there are also solutions and mitigation factors to how to really target, how to do this in a way that minimizes the harm and the benefit that you gain from shifting off of fossil fuels that we know are driving climate change around the world can lead to healthier environments. For all of this stuff related to industry, there are good ways and there are harmful ways. And it's about trying to leverage science, looking to the evidence to really figure out how we can do this in a way that protects people, protects the animals, and leads to a safer environment for all. So it's not as easy as a yes or no. It depends on each situation. But I think really looking at that science and some of the due diligence that groups are doing all around the world right now to measure the baseline of what animals are there, how do we pick the right locations and are really strategic around that, and how do we build and execute these plans in a way that doesn't cause undue harm or more harm to these populations that we love so much.
Ted, what's your thoughts on offshore wind farms?
Boy, I'm really struck by the intensity of feelings around offshore wind farm. And I'm also struck by how divorced it seems to be from any evidence, right? And that's not to say that it isn't an impact, but I had the experience of a publication, a press release about some science we did, just getting trolled about with anti-wind farm rhetoric. And I had to step back and say, well, what's the motivation here? And in fact, assuming it was human authors and not bots, but might have been bots, who knows? Is there actually an interest in caring about the ocean here? And I think, just exactly what Adam said is there's a good way and a bad way to do this. We are urbanizing our oceans. We're asking for more from the resources at sea. And yet we also are increasing our caring for the space. We really want these animals to survive. I mean, 100 years ago, at the peak of industrial whaling, there was no thought to the possibility of them being of these resources being exhausted. We now know the very finite limits here, and so yeah, that open ocean wind is a darn good resource because we will keep using power. I feel like good science can be a huge asset, and and hopefully we can also, I mean, honestly, I love this podcast because it is an element of this podcast is building a community around having the conversation that says, hey, we care about this space. How can we approach it more with heart and science? And that, I feel like there are solutions in there,
What about offshore drilling rigs? We're maybe trashing the wind farms a little bit. What about offshore drilling rigs, Philip?
I know less about that just because we have fewer of them in the Atlantic. And, quite honestly, this is just my personal perspective. That is putting the money and potential damage into the ocean into an industry that we know is already causing harm. So I'm not a fan of that. As far as the impact on certainly right whales, I have no idea. Yeah.
What about you, Adam? Any offshore drilling rigs in your area?
Not particularly off the part of California that I'm based in, but I think, again, to Philip's point, we know that there are better ways to generate energy today that have less negative impacts on our environment and on animals. And being able to shift to that focus and look towards solar, look towards wind, gives us just more opportunities moving forward than being stuck in the past a little bit. We know that it's cheaper to actually build solar and wind operations than to use existing coal and methane gas operations in most parts of the world. So we can find solutions where we can create enough power to run all the things that we want to do, but do it in a way that doesn't harm the environment in the process. And I think that's the thing that we just need to always come back to when we think about where we get our energy from, what industry do we continue to put money into versus to shift? Because the solutions are out there. We're not waiting for science to save us. We just need to make sure that we're leaning into the ones that can have the most benefit for the most people and animals.
Ted, any thoughts on offshore drilling rigs?
Doesn't have a good ocean safety track record, honestly. And I guess to me, it's, and not to get too wonky here, but to me, the outstanding element there is, uncaptured externalities, right? Who is bearing and what bears the cost, right? We know that it's profitable for the industry behind it, right? But I think it's only profitable if society at large bears the cost rather than the operators, paying for the broader cost. I mean, what was the cost of the Deepwater Horizon, disaster, right? And what is so crazy about that one So if I understand things correctly, for Louisiana, after that, which the disaster basically caused marine fishing resources to collapse. So what was left to them? More oil. Like what kind of devil's paradise, devil's choice is that, right? If the oil drilling destroys the alternative industries and alternative sustenance, then all you can do is invest deeper in oil. Boy, then I think we're painting ourselves into a pretty nasty corner there. I just don't see it as the solution for our climate ills at all.
So what are the solutions? Ted, how resilient are the oceans and marine mammals?
I mean, the evidence of the recovery of many whale populations and many species the last 100 years, and this isn't just whales, but kind of more broadly, nature's many habitats, is when we leave enough space, when we take away the major forcings, the hunting, the habitat destruction, not necessarily quickly, but these animals can rebound. North Atlantic right whales, for all their suffering now, for a long time, the population was growing until that tide shifted against them, right? And I think that there's, cause for a great deal of hope there if we can step back and understand what we're doing and find those solutions. What they are, there's no silver bullet, right? This is, I think it was an Al Gore line, silver buckshot with regards to climate change, right? There's many things that have to happen. And it starts, it's like we want to, act locally. Well, the individual action is obviously there's many, the recycling, the electric car, whatever we can do, but it's also the act locally is demand change of the government, because much of this has to be collective solutions.
Adam, how do we raise awareness of climate problems and solutions? I mean, how do we get people talking about this?
I think that's one of the big challenges, and Ted spoke to this about what makes this community, this podcast so powerful, is that it invites conversation. When we look at public perceptions around the country, we know that the vast majority of people in the US care about climate change. They're worried about it. They want to do something about it. But at the same time, only around 24% of people in the US hear about climate change once a month or more from the people they know. So there's a spiral of silence around climate change, unfortunately, that if people aren't hearing about it, they don't realize that they're actually in the majority, that most of the people around them care just as much as they do. So the more we can invite conversation, talk about climate change, bring up the solutions that exist, whether it's the things you can do as an individual or building that community at home, at school, within your business that allows for this collective change, that's going to make a really big difference. I'll also add, just from the marine mammal perspective, there are many groups like the Marine Mammal Center that are there to help animals that are in harm. So if you see a sick or injured marine mammal along the beaches, if you're within the 600 miles of California coast the Marine Mammal Center responds to, you can get on the phone, give us a call. We'll send trained responders out to that animal, bring them to our hospital, give them the care they need, and release them back out to the ocean with a second chance at life. So there are ways to help the individual here. There are also ways to move things forward as a society.
Philip, what are your solutions?
Well, I'll say a little bit about both resilience and solutions. So, right whales and many whales will give birth throughout their lives. They don't really go through a reproductive senescence. So they have adapted to many changes over the centuries, including little ice ages, whaling. I have a lot of, well, the hope that I have comes from their long-lived nature and the fact that they can reproduce for a very long time. We have one whale named Wart who has brought at least 30 different individuals into the population, and we know many of the grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And it shows the value of just a single individual, especially a female. And so if we can protect and save just one or two of those, it makes a really big impact. The way that we can do that, so the solution side of things, we actually know what some of the solutions are, and some of them are evolving. There's relatively new technology where the ropes that are entangling whales are actually coiled at the bottom next to the trap or the net, and you can release that through an acoustic pinger, so that the rope is only in the water for when the fisher folk are hauling their gear or setting their gear, or just actually hauling their gear. So that's really, one exciting technology. We also have a lot, we're improving our communications. And so near real-time notifications of where animals are and where hotspots are forming. We have a really cool website, whalemap.org, which shows all the survey efforts that are happening and where all the sightings are, and that sort of communication exchange will help. And we know things like slowing ships down in certain places has been effective. So there are solutions. It comes down to political will, and also in the case of the fishing industry, I think they really need to be supported to make some of the cultural and systemic changes that will benefit marine mammals, and I think in the long run will actually benefit them. But it's a huge transition to change how you're going about fishing. So they need to be supported both financially and sort of culturally.
So tell us a little bit about your group and where our listeners can go to learn more about it. Adam, tell us about the Marine Mammal Center.
So the Marine Mammal Center is based in Sausalito, California, but responds to sick and injured animals from Mendocino County to San Luis Obispo County, as well as having a hospital out in Hawaii for the endangered monk seal. If you want to know more, go to marinemammalcenter.org.
Thank you. Ted, tell us about Happy Whale.
Sure, yeah. So actually, this is, for me, it's my little part of the solution, which is that I feel like it's really hard to relate to these animals, out of sight, out of mind, but we're trying to put the individual in there. So what we built is a system at the website happywhale.com, where if you photograph a whale, humpback whales in particular, when they dive, they lift their tails and they're individually recognizable. And so when you photograph that whale out whale watching, you can submit the photo to this website and we'll tell you who the whale is, and you can track the whale for the rest of its long lives. These animals may live as long as we do. And this has been really, really effective to get a lot of data. So our side of it is we get the data of where that whale is and when. And then the public engagement side of it is, getting to know a whale as individuals. Many of these whales have names, like Phil's wart there. I love that. And yesterday I just saw a whale named Heart Attack. It was named because it breached right next to a ship and actually splashed the whale watchers aboard. But yeah, happywhale.com. It's we actually collaborate fairly closely with the Marine Mammal Center. It's really a delightful community as well.
So Philip, tell us about the Kraus Marine Mammal Program and the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium.
Yeah, so the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium is based in Boston, part of the aquarium itself, but we have a fairly significant research and conservation program. And as far as the right whale goes, we have aerial surveys that have actually been surveying the waters around where the wind farms are going in for a number of years before the construction, during the construction. So it's exactly what we've been talking about, needing the good science to look at what the potential impacts are. We have our team that does field work as well as the photo ID catalog. And we also have a really cool lab that is looking at hormone levels in right whales and many other species through biopsy samples, collection of blow samples, fecal samples, and now increasingly baleen samples from dead animals. So it's a really cool mix of things at the aquarium, and it's www.neaq.org.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.